Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Ross. I'm 32 years old. 3 years ago, my parents forced me to surrender my inheritance. They transferred $6.2 million to my sister while I stood there in silence. They called it restructuring. They called me unstable. They publicly branded me the family failure. And on Wednesday evening, at exactly 8:57 p.m., my attorney called with a sentence that froze the air in my executive suite. "Your father isn't calling to threaten you," he said. "He's calling because the Canyon Crest Expansion collapses in 72 hours if you refuse to sign." What they never imagined. And for the past 4 hours, the only sound inside the executive suite of Titan Ridge Development LLC has been the steady scrape of my red pen across oversized architectural blueprints. It was close to 9 at night. Outside my windows, downtown Denver glowed beneath low storm clouds, amber streetlights blurring into the dark. Inside, the air carried the scent of stale coffee, fresh printer ink, and the faint trace of drywall dust that still clung to my boots. I stood over a heavy oak drafting table, finalizing compliance documentation for a large industrial redevelopment site. This was my battlefield. Every permit, every zoning variance, every environmental clearance stacked in those binders represented relentless, disciplined work. I was exactly where I had rebuilt myself. Insulated from the past, fully in control of my own company. Then my phone vibrated against the wood. The quiet shattered. I glanced down. Ethan Caldwell, my lead corporate counsel. Ethan was not a man who called casually. He operated in clean contracts and measurable risk. If he was calling at 9 on a Wednesday night, something serious had shifted. I answered without looking away from the drainage schematics. "Tell me the steel shipment didn't fall through," I said evenly, my voice slipping into the steady command tone I used on job sites. "The materials are secure," Ethan replied. I stopped writing. The pen hovered in midair. His voice was wrong. Ethan normally spoke fast, efficient, clipped, always half a step ahead. Tonight, his tone was controlled. Too controlled. The kind of calm that meant something volatile was sitting on the table. "Then what is it?" I asked, straightening, my back tightening. "I just got off the phone," he said carefully. "Your father's attorney, Victor Langford, contacted me. They're requesting a conversation. Tonight." The name hit harder than I expected. Victor Langford, the architect of my exile. The man who drafted the documents that severed my name from the Ross estate. For a moment, the temperature in my office seemed to drop. I felt a phantom weight in my hand, the memory of the pen they'd forced me to sign with 3 years ago. I exhaled once, slow, controlled, and turned away from the table. This was another tactic. Another maneuver, another attempt at emotional leverage from a family that had perfected humiliation. "Tell them no," I said, my voice flattening into ice. "Tell Langford to lose both our numbers. I'm not entertaining whatever game Andrew Ross thinks he's playing. They made their decision. I moved on." "Caroline," Ethan interrupted, "this isn't a game. Listen to me." The edge in his tone was sharp enough to make me go still. "This isn't intimidation. They're not playing psychological games. They're in serious trouble." I stared at the blank beige wall across from my desk. "What are you talking about?" I heard the soft shuffle of thick files on his end of the line. "Your family's flagship development, the Canyon Crest Expansion. The lenders just slammed on the brakes. The entire financing structure is frozen. They can't close the capital gap." I frowned, struggling to follow. I had deliberately cut myself off from anything involving the Ross name. I hadn't read a single article, press release, or industry rumor about them since the day I walked out of that house. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my grip tightening around the phone. "Let it collapse. It has nothing to do with me. I haven't touched a piece of their empire since they erased me from the estate." "It has everything to do with you," Ethan replied, his words landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. "The Canyon Crest project is stalled because they're missing a mandatory signature from an adjoining property owner. They require it for emergency access and high-capacity drainage easements. Without that signature, the bank pulls over $400 million in financing." I went quiet. "Okay," I said slowly, confusion tightening my chest. "And," he continued, leaving just enough silence to make my pulse spike, "that adjoining property is owned by Silver Hollow Capital." "My company?" "Silver Hollow Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of Titan Ridge Development," he said evenly. "They need the signature from the owner of that land, Caroline." My lungs stopped working. "That owner is you." The room seemed to tilt. The cracked concrete staging yard I'd purchased years ago for equipment storage, the ugly, overlooked strip of land no one wanted, was now the single structural bottleneck holding their entire legacy hostage. The irony was so massive it felt unreal. Before I could even process it, Ethan delivered the final blow. "Victor Langford didn't call to threaten you," he said quietly. "He didn't call to posture, and he definitely didn't call to negotiate from strength. He sounded desperate. He's asking for a 72-hour extension before the primary lender pulls funding and the Canyon Crest Expansion collapses." 72 hours. A countdown. I slowly lowered my pen and let it fall onto the desk with a dull clatter. Then I walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass window. My boots were heavy against the hardwood as I pressed my palm to the cool glass and looked out over Denver's dark skyline. My reflection stared back at me. Tailored work shirt, steady eyes, controlled posture. A woman who had built an empire from scraps. But as I held my own gaze in the glass, the city lights began to blur. The hum of the air conditioning faded, and the reflection fractured. The glow of Denver dissolved into the blinding, merciless sun of Scottsdale, Arizona. The 72-hour clock ticking in my head was drowned out by the memory of a long, mahogany table. 3 years ago. The day my life split in half. The day they handed Madeline Ross $6.2 million. The day my mother looked me in the eyes, in front of extended family, and called me the greatest disappointment of her life. The text had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, from Helianthe Ross. It read like a corporate summons. No greeting, no how are you, just a directive. "We are having a family meeting this Sunday in Scottsdale. Your attendance is mandatory. Do not be late." Those 2 sentences sat in my chest all weekend. I drove south through the desert in the middle of the night, my old pickup rattling across the highway. The air shifted from the cool elevation outside Denver to the suffocating desert heat near Phoenix, mirroring the dread building in my stomach. My mother never scheduled a meeting without a strategy behind it. In the Ross household, family meeting never meant dinner. It meant restructuring. I passed through the wrought iron security gates of my parents' estate just before 9 in the morning. Manicured desert landscaping, artificially green lawn, a stone facade designed to project invincibility. Everything about it screamed controlled wealth. I parked my truck out of sight, suddenly aware of the dust on the tires and the faint smear of grease on my jeans. I had no idea I was walking into my own trial. When I pushed open the heavy double doors, the blast of air conditioning hit me like a sheet of ice. The house was silent, not peaceful, loaded. I walked toward the formal dining room and stopped in the archway. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a tribunal. The long mahogany table had been stripped bare. No flowers, no candles, no warmth. More than a dozen relatives were already seated. Aunts, uncles, older cousins who only surfaced for galas or funerals sat upright in high-backed leather chairs. Their expressions were blank, deliberately blank, a silent jury. At the head of the table sat Andrew Ross, dressed in a tailored suit on a Sunday morning, posture stiff, eyes fixed downward. To his right sat Victor Langford, adjusting his rimless glasses, manicured hands resting on a thick, leather-bound legal binder. But the gravitational center of the room was my sister, Madeline Ross. She sat directly across from the attorney, wearing a flawless ivory silk blouse, her posture composed, serene, untouchable. Madeline was already a rising star in corporate litigation, the golden daughter, the one who had never disappointed. One look at her calm expression told me everything. She knew. She helped design this. "Sit down, Caroline," my father said. His voice was empty. He gestured to the single open chair at the far end of the table, as far from him as possible. I sat. The leather creaked beneath me. No one offered water. No one acknowledged the overnight drive. Victor Langford didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He snapped open the binder, the metal rings echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling, and began reading from a prepared statement in a sterile, rehearsed tone. He announced the immediate implementation of a new succession structure. Family trusts would be reallocated, real estate holdings restructured, liquid assets redistributed. Then he said the number. $6.2 million. Cash reserves, high-yield investment accounts, property deeds, all transferred in full to Madeline Ross, granting her exclusive control over the Ross family's generational wealth. I sat very still. My hands rested on my knees under the table. I waited. Surely there was a second half. Surely there was some provision, some reduced trust, some smaller allocation. Victor closed the binder. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thin manila folder, almost insultingly light, and slid it down the length of the polished table until it stopped in front of me. I opened it. One document. A comprehensive waiver of estate claims. An ironclad non-contest clause. A strict non-disclosure agreement. 3 pages of suffocating legal language designed for one purpose: to erase me. In that entire succession plan, my name existed only as a liability to be removed. I looked up from the white paper. My relatives avoided my eyes, suddenly fascinated by china cabinets and ceiling moldings. Madeline gave me a small, polished smile, sympathetic in shape, cold in substance. Finally, I looked toward the head of the table. "What about me?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. It carried. My father shifted in his chair, suddenly engrossed in the wood grain beneath his hands. He couldn't do it. He couldn't deliver the final blow himself. That responsibility belonged to my mother. Helianthe Ross straightened in her seat, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist as if preparing for a performance. She met my eyes directly. There was no hesitation, no discomfort, only aristocratic disdain. "You have always been this family's worst investment, Caroline," she said evenly. Every word was precise, polished, weaponized. "We do not continue funding failure." My jaw tightened. I refused to give her the reaction she wanted. "An investment," I repeated flatly. "Look at yourself," my mother continued, her voice sharpening with open disgust. "You walked away from a seat at a top-tier law school. You humiliated us in front of our colleagues. And for what? To play contractor? To stand on filthy job sites supervising day laborers and coming home covered in dust? She leaned back slightly, as if presenting evidence. You chose an unstable, blue-collar life that drags this family's name through the mud. You are a liability. We are simply managing our risk. The arrogance of that logic settled over the room like smoke. I wasn't addicted to anything. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't a criminal. I had chosen to build something tangible instead of arguing over contracts and climate-controlled offices. I chose steel over status, concrete over cocktail parties, real exhaustion over curated appearances. And for that decision, I was being surgically removed from the family. Pressure built in my chest. For a moment, I wanted to flip the table, to scream, to force my father to look at me and defend me, just once. But when I saw his lowered head and Madeline's quiet, victorious composure, I understood something critical. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me hysterical. They wanted tears, proof that I was unstable, emotional, unfit. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen. I didn't read the waiver again. I didn't scan for hidden traps. The money meant nothing in that moment. The only thing that mattered was my dignity. I signed. One clean, heavy stroke across the line. I flipped to the next page and signed again, closed the folder, and slid it back across the table. Then I stood. The scrape of my chair against hardwood cracked through the silence like a gunshot. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at my father. I didn't say goodbye. I turned my back on the tribunal and walked down the long hallway, boots echoing against marble tile. When I pushed open the front doors, the Arizona sun hit me full force, blinding, relentless. The heat wrapped around me like a furnace, thawing the ice that had settled in my veins. I walked down the long driveway toward my truck without slowing. Behind me, the massive oak doors shut with a hollow, final thud. No one called after me. No one followed. I traded the desert estate for a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Denver. Thin walls, clanking pipes, a radiator that sounded like it was arguing with itself every night. My life shrank to diesel fuel receipts, insurance payments, and scraping together short-term site management contracts. I woke up at 4 a.m, drinking bitter coffee and spending 12 hours coordinating electricians, plumbers, drywall crews, anyone willing to work. It was brutal. I was a young woman on underfunded job sites, commanding crews who tested my authority at every turn. My back ached constantly. My account balance hovered close to zero. But for the first month, I slept. I told myself I had bought my freedom. I believed that by signing the inheritance away quietly, they would leave me alone. That once I disappeared, they would move on. That was my first mistake. 6 weeks later, reality snapped into place. I had spent 14 exhausting days preparing a meticulous bid for a mid-sized commercial warehouse renovation. That warehouse project wasn't just another contract. It was a lifeline. The projected margin would have covered my rent and truck payments for at least 6 months. On Tuesday afternoon, the developer had shaken my hand, praising my aggressive timeline and tight numbers. By Thursday morning, I received a sterile, formal email terminating the agreement. No explanation, just concerns regarding long-term stability and questions about stress management capacity. I stared at the screen. Long-term stability, professional judgment, risk profile. Those weren't construction terms. Those were courtroom words. I forced myself to swallow the loss and pivot. I chased a smaller residential framing contract. 3 days later, that foreman called to withdraw. He cleared his throat twice before mentioning that he'd heard some things about my history with liability exposure. He wouldn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I sat at my scratched kitchen table, staring at my laptop while those phrases looped in my mind. Stability, risk, judgment. That wasn't job site language. It was corporate litigation vocabulary. Someone had drafted a script. I discovered the ghost behind it at a lumber yard on the outskirts of town. During a rushed lunch break, I ran into an old estimating contact, a man who still circulated in the same real estate development circles as my family. He bought me a lukewarm coffee from a vending machine and refused to meet my eyes. After 10 minutes of strange small talk, the guilt finally cracked him. He'd attended a high-profile development dinner in Phoenix the previous weekend. Madeline Ross had been seated at the center table. When an investor casually mentioned my name, looking for a site coordinator, Madeline had sighed, soft and sympathetic. Then she leaned in and quietly suggested that I had caused serious undisclosed complications on a prior project. She implied the family had been forced to legally distance themselves from me to avoid catastrophic liability. No specifics, no facts, no accusations that could be challenged in court, just implication. It was flawless. A masterclass in character assassination. In commercial development, where a single lawsuit can derail millions in financing, doubt is fatal. No one hires a site manager who comes with whispered warnings from a respected corporate attorney. That afternoon, desperation settled into my bones. It's a hollow feeling. It scrapes away pride. I sat in the baking cab of my truck and dialed the only person in the Ross family I believed might still have a conscience. My father's brother. He'd slipped me $100 at my high school graduation and once asked about my projects with genuine curiosity. He answered on the fourth ring. I didn't ask him for money. I didn't ask for a referral. I asked him to speak to my father, to call off whatever was happening, to let me work in peace. There was a long silence on the line. 10 seconds that felt like a verdict. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. He said the Ross household was tense. He said Andrew was furious about my departure. He said Madeline was fiercely protective of the family brand. Then he asked me not to call again. He didn't want to be caught in the middle. The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly into my lap. The isolation was suffocating. They had not just taken my past, they were actively, methodically hunting down my future. They wanted me starving, broken, and crawling back to the estate to beg for scraps, just to prove their narrative right. Night settled over the gravel lot of the lumberyard. Industrial floodlights flickered on, casting long, sharp shadows across pallets of concrete block and stacks of raw timber. The smell of sawdust, hot asphalt, and diesel seeped into the cab of my truck. I didn't cry. Crying is a luxury for people who have somewhere safe to fall. Instead, I reached across the dashboard and grabbed my worn leather field notebook. I flipped past measurements and material estimates until I found a blank page. With a thick black marker, I drew a hard line straight down the center. On one side, I could have listed what I'd lost. I didn't. I knew exactly what they had taken. Instead, I wrote down what they couldn't touch. My endurance. My knowledge of municipal code. My ability to read a complex structural blueprint faster than most licensed architects. My discipline. My work ethic. My reputation for clean execution. Line after line, I filled the page with the raw materials of survival. They had stripped away the money, the last name, the network. But sitting there in the dark, surrounded by steel frames and half-built structures, I understood something clearly. They had left me the only tools that actually mattered: skill, strategy, and nothing left to lose. I closed the notebook, turned the ignition, and drove into the desert night. I wasn't waiting for them to stop hunting me. I was going to build something so structurally sound, so legally armored, that their shadows could never reach it. A month later, a violent storm system tore through parts of Colorado and neighboring states, destroying infrastructure and displacing thousands. Local governments scrambled to create emergency housing. Contractors were hiring anyone who could work. I packed my truck and drove straight into the disaster zone. I needed distance from the Ross name. A place where the only currency was competence. I accepted a seasonal field coordinator role with a rapid response development firm called Holt Infrastructure Group. The operation was chaos. We converted damaged commercial properties into emergency shelters and logistical hubs under impossible timelines. The company was held together by one woman, Sabrina Holt. Former municipal permitting director, razor sharp, unimpressed by titles, fueled by black coffee and relentless efficiency. It took her less than 48 hours to realize I wasn't a temporary hire. On my second day, she tossed a dense set of structural blueprints onto the hood of my truck, expecting me to spend an hour reviewing them. I handed them back in 3 minutes. "There's a fire egress violation here," I said, pointing to a flawed corridor layout that violated state emergency compliance standards. She didn't praise me, didn't nod. She just narrowed her eyes, took the plans, and moved me from the labor rotation into the command trailer. The real test came 2 weeks later. It was 2 a.m. Freezing rain slashed sideways across the site while we raced to retrofit an abandoned warehouse into a temporary medical triage center. We were on a hard municipal deadline. Then, everything stopped. The lead mechanical contractor stormed into the trailer, soaked and furious. He slammed his clipboard onto the table. The electrical and ventilation systems couldn't move forward. The compliance packet was missing a required environmental variance from the city. He declared the job shut down, threatened to pull his entire 40-man crew off-site. He wasn't risking his license for a project that wasn't airtight. Every hour of delay was bleeding tens of thousands of dollars, and every hour meant families waiting longer for medical care. Inside that command trailer, junior coordinators were shouting over each other, panic rising fast. I didn't argue with the contractor. I didn't escalate. I pulled a clean legal pad toward me and started rebuilding the entire municipal compliance checklist from memory. I knew exactly which department issued that specific environmental variance. More importantly, I knew the obscure emergency bylaws that allowed retroactive filing during a declared state of emergency. At 3:15 a.m., I called a regional building inspector and woke him up. My tone was calm, precise, relentlessly logical. I cited the statute numbers, walked him through the structural compliance line by line, verified everything verbally, secured provisional authorization. By 3:52 a.m., I had a digitally signed waiver in my inbox. At exactly 4 a.m., I stepped back into the freezing rain and found the mechanical contractor under a floodlight. I handed him the printed authorization. "You've got 20 minutes to finish your coffee," I said evenly. "Then your crew is back on lifts." Work resumed. No applause, no debate, just movement. The next morning, Sabrina Holt called me into her makeshift office. She didn't congratulate me, didn't dramatize it. She poured black coffee into a chipped mug, slid it across the desk, and looked at me steadily. "You don't panic," she said flatly. "When everything collapses, everyone else screams. You start rebuilding." She paused. I need that on my payroll. I walked out with a full-time contract and expanded authority. Under Sabrina's mentorship, I stopped surviving. I started specializing. Holt's infrastructure shifted from emergency recovery to acquiring distressed commercial properties. We bought abandoned warehouses and turned them into community centers, converted dying strip malls into mobile clinics, revived industrial zones no one else would touch. I worked 80-hour weeks. I studied zoning overlays until they felt like a second language. I memorized contradictory layers of municipal code. But the most important thing I learned wasn't in a textbook. It was about land, utility easements, drainage corridors, emergency access rights of way. In commercial development, power doesn't always belong to the person who owns the tallest building. Sometimes it belongs to the person who controls the small, overlooked strip of land that building cannot function without. A legal bottleneck. An invisible tripwire. At the time, I treated it like an intellectual puzzle. I had no idea I was studying the exact mechanism that would one day put my family on their knees. Even as my career accelerated, Arizona still lived in the back of my mind. I constantly expected the ground to disappear beneath me again, Sabrina noticed. One evening, she tapped a thick stack of filed contracts on her desk and gave me the advice that rewired everything. Good work isn't enough, she said. Being honest isn't enough. Truth doesn't automatically win. She held my gaze. You need better records than the person trying to bury you. That sentence changed me. I realized I had been naive. I believed effort would defend me. It didn't. So I built armor. Every professional email archived on encrypted drives. Every phone call logged with timestamps and summaries. Every site photographed daily and stored in secure backups. Every verbal agreement confirmed in writing. I stopped operating like someone hoping not to be attacked. I started operating like someone preparing for war. I built documentation walls so thick that no narrative could punch through them again. Exactly 12 months after I arrived in that disaster zone, Sabrina slid a new contract across her desk. The title at the top read, Strategic Project Executive. Sabrina didn't want me in the field anymore. She wanted me in the boardroom, managing entire development cycles, negotiating financing, controlling execution from blueprint to ribbon cutting. I read the contract carefully. The base salary was generous, high 6 figures. I crossed it out. I lowered the guaranteed salary and added one non-negotiable clause. 15% of net profit on every development I personally led. Sabrina looked at the edit. Then she laughed, sharp and genuine, and initialed it without hesitation. She respected leverage. From there, we dismantled the old structure of the company and rebuilt it from the foundation up. We stopped competing in standard municipal bids. We started hunting ghosts. The ugliest properties. The ones drowning in tax liens, environmental violations, zoning conflicts. Concrete skeletons no one else wanted. We bought them cheap, untangled the legal mess aggressively, rebuilt them faster than traditional firms could clear initial paperwork. To manage the scale and protect ourselves from liability, I established my own corporate entity. I filed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning and named it Titan Ridge Development, LLC. Titan Ridge became the operational engine. Construction ran through it. Risk stayed compartmentalized. Our legal profile was clean, sharp, structured. Banks loved clean. The turning point came with a massive abandoned retail property on the edge of Denver. The roof was collapsing. The parking lot looked like a war zone. Zoning variances were considered toxic. Most developers wouldn't touch it. Through Titan Ridge, I orchestrated a ruthless turnaround. We gutted 90,000 square feet of dead retail space and rebuilt it into a vocational training campus anchored by mobile medical offices. 9 months. 9. The transformation was so fast and the margins so aggressive that industry publications ran features on the project. Suddenly, lenders weren't screening my calls. They were inviting me to private lunches, asking how much capital I needed next. That project was also the moment I secured independent legal counsel. I interviewed 5 corporate attorneys before choosing Ethan Caldwell. He wasn't charming. He wasn't warm. He was surgical. At our first meeting, he returned a draft agreement to me covered in red ink. "Stop reviewing contracts like a builder," he said. "Review them like someone who expects betrayal." He rewrote clauses assuming someone would try to twist them tomorrow. Exit strategies, indemnities, safeguards layered on safeguards. Ethan didn't just protect Titan Ridge. He weaponized it. As the company's reputation expanded, revenue followed. High 7-figure margins. But my lifestyle didn't change. I kept the same cramped apartment, drove the same aging truck, avoided industry galas. Instead, I reinvested everything, built a cash reserve large enough to survive downturns without begging lenders, hired electricians who'd been downsized, permit specialists overlooked for lacking pedigree, logistics managers who could stretch a budget until it screamed. In my office, last names meant nothing. Delivery meant everything. By the end of my second year running Titan Ridge, I sat alone late one night, reviewing quarterly statements. I traced my finger down the final column. By the end of that second year, we had accumulated over $3 million in unrestricted liquid capital. Our credit rating was spotless. Our development portfolio was clean. We weren't chasing scraps anymore. We had the cash, the legal insulation, and the market credibility to acquire distressed properties outright. I closed the ledger and leaned back in my chair. The transformation was undeniable. I wasn't a discarded daughter scrambling for subcontract work. I wasn't maneuvering pieces on someone else's board. I owned the board. Then, late on a Tuesday night, my phone lit up. A secure message from Daniel Mercer. I hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years. He was a meticulous title analyst I'd worked with early in my career. Seeing his name triggered something instinctive. The message was brief, careful. He asked whether I was currently involved in any active litigation or serious family disputes. He mentioned that my name, and specifically Titan Ridge Development, had appeared in a few irregular internal email threads during a routine underwriting review. I stepped out of my office and called him immediately. Daniel didn't forward the emails. He was too smart for that. Over a secured line, he described what he'd seen. Someone with influence was attaching my professional profile to carefully chosen red flag language, words designed to trigger automatic internal alerts in conservative lending departments. High-risk liability, unresolved internal issues. Proceed with extreme caution. Not accusations, not claims, just implication. The kind of sterile, legally ambiguous phrasing that causes a bank to quietly decline financing without ever explaining why. I didn't need an investigator. I knew exactly who it was. Madeline Ross. A younger version of me might have flown to Scottsdale, stormed into her office, demanded confrontation. I felt the anger rise. Then I remembered Sabrina's voice. Paper trail, not performance. My sister wasn't trying to defeat me publicly. She was trying to starve me quietly. And if I reacted emotionally, she would use it as validation. I ended the call with Daniel, poured a glass of ice water, and sat at my desk. I documented everything. Time, date, exact phrasing, tone. The next morning, I placed the memo in front of Ethan Caldwell. No drama, No backstory, just facts. We're dealing with targeted corporate interference, I said evenly. Ethan didn't blink. He opened an encrypted offline directory and began constructing what he called a shadow file. We mapped every major bid we'd lost over the previous 18 months, every financing withdrawal, every hesitant joint venture partner. We cross-referenced those incidents with conferences, industry panels, and markets where Madeline's law firm had influence. This wasn't emotional speculation. It was forensic accounting. Weeks later, a clearer picture emerged. Madeline wasn't hiding behind anonymous accounts. She wasn't whispering at cocktail parties. She was leveraging her title. At compliance seminars, at private underwriting dinners, at closed-door development summits, she wrapped her sabotage in professional courtesy, staring at the growing timeline projected onto the wall of Ethan's office. A profound realization washed over me. This wasn't personal bitterness. It wasn't petty sibling rivalry. In her world, reputation was currency, and mine was threatening her balance sheet. She was watching Titan Ridge development gain traction inside the exact commercial real estate ecosystem where she built her influence. If I kept expanding, if I kept closing deals on my own terms, eventually, our professional worlds would collide. And if that happened, the narrative she had carefully crafted about me would collapse. She wasn't trying to embarrass me. She was trying to starve me. Later that afternoon, Sabrina Holt stepped into the conference room and studied the web of evidence Ethan had mapped across the board. She crossed her arms. "Do you want me to authorize a multi-million-dollar defamation and tortious interference suit by Friday?" she asked bluntly. The temptation was real. Dropping a lawsuit on the Ross name? Forcing Madeline to defend herself publicly? Watching the headlines unravel her reputation. It would have been satisfying, but I shook my head. Not yet. We had patterns. We had correlations. But we didn't have the smoking gun, a direct, written link tying her language to a specific lost contract. A premature strike would drag me back into their arena. They had deeper legal reserves, political relationships, home court advantage in Arizona. If I sued too early, she would clean up her tracks. So I made the colder decision. Absorb the friction, expand anyway. From that moment forward, everything changed operationally. Every land acquisition, every vendor agreement, every permit application was treated like it might explode. Ethan reviewed contracts from the very first draft. We layered redundant financing contingencies to bypass lenders she'd poisoned. We moved quietly, deliberately. Not just building developments, building a fortress. Then Ethan and I incorporated a secondary legal entity. We named it Silver Hollow Capital. If Titan Ridge was the visible engine, Silver Hollow was the vault. Its acquisition strategy was ruthlessly specific. We didn't chase glamorous downtown towers or suburban subdivisions. We hunted complicated industrial land, parcels strangled by zoning restrictions, burdened with environmental flags, geographically awkward, legally inconvenient. Late that fall, a 3-lot package hit the market on the outskirts of the Phoenix metropolitan area. 2 parcels were standard desert scrubland. The third was an eyesore, a fractured concrete slab abandoned for over a decade. Useless to most developers, but buried deep in the municipal filings, I found something interesting. A grandfathered high-capacity drainage connection, and an unusually wide utility easement running straight through the center. Ugly land, powerful positioning. I wasn't thinking about my family. I needed a staging yard for equipment and material storage for upcoming Southwest bids. The logistics made sense. Silver Hollow Capital purchased the entire 3-lot package in cash, quietly. 6 months later, I flew to Dallas, Texas, for a regional infrastructure and commercial development summit. The convention center was loud. Glossy renderings, polished pitches, aggressive networking. I was walking through the main exhibition hall, holding a bitter cup of convention coffee, when I stopped. Across the aisle, a massive illuminated display dominated a corner booth. Elegant typography across the top read, Canyon Crest Expansion. Below, a stunning, highly detailed rendering of a sprawling, multi-use commercial and luxury residential complex. Two names were prominently listed as the lead visionary partners: Andrew Ross, Madeline Ross. I didn't walk toward their booth. I didn't stare at the renderings. I didn't let my pulse betray me. I turned calmly, exited the exhibition hall, and found a quiet corner in the lobby. Then I called Ethan Caldwell. "Run a discrete title and zoning check on the Canyon Crest footprint," I told him. "I just want to understand the scale of the sandbox." Nothing more, just situational awareness. I flew back to Denver that night and buried the encounter beneath active projects and quarterly targets. 2 days later, Ethan walked into my office without greeting me. He moved past my desk, picked up the remote, and projected his screen onto the wall monitor. A high-resolution topographical map of the Phoenix metropolitan outskirts filled the room. He traced a massive boundary in red. "That's the finalized Canyon Crest perimeter," he said. Then he clicked again. A small, jagged parcel along the southern edge lit up in blue. My parcel. Owned by Silver Hollow Capital. Ethan turned to face me. "Developments at that density require 2 mandatory approvals before lenders release primary funding," he said evenly. "First, a secondary heavy-load emergency access corridor for fire services. Second, a high-capacity stormwater runoff channel to prevent infrastructure flooding." He tapped the screen. The only legally viable path for both ran directly through the center of my blue square. The coincidence was staggering. I leaned back in my chair. There was no rush of triumph, no smile. This wasn't victory. It was volatility. If Andrew or Madeline discovered who owned that parcel before their mezzanine financing locked into escrow, they could pivot, redesign the master plan at enormous cost, or worse, leverage political relationships to initiate an eminent domain action. I looked at Ethan. "Absolute silence," I said. No one in our company was to mention it. No internal chatter, no loose emails. I ordered a full historical deed audit on the parcel, environmental reviews rechecked, municipal codes cross-referenced. I wanted defensive strategy prepared for every conceivable legal maneuver. When Ethan left to begin the lockdown, I stayed seated. The satellite map remained glowing on the wall, a vast red empire pressed against a fractured blue square. And for the first time since that freezing mahogany dining room, I understood the scale of my family's arrogance. They had designed a masterpiece, secured hundreds of millions in layered financing, staked their generational legacy on one towering, immaculate project. And they had built it on the assumption that the ugly parcel next door was insignificant, ownerless, or controlled by someone too small to matter. They never imagined the nobody owned the bottleneck, and they had no idea they had handed the detonator to the very daughter they erased. The memory of that Arizona dining room snapped apart, the mahogany table, the waiver, my mother's voice. It dissolved, and I was back in my office. The cold glass beneath my palm, the amber glow of Denver's skyline reflecting back at me. The cheap ballpoint pen was gone. In its place was the weight of something far more solid. Control. My phone was still pressed to my ear. Ethan was still waiting. "Tell me exactly how the bank found the bottleneck," I said, my voice steady now. No trace of the past, just command. He broke it down clinically. The mezzanine lender had entered the final underwriting phase just hours earlier, the mandatory deep dive before releasing primary construction capital. Senior underwriters traced every required utility corridor and emergency easement inch by inch. When they reached the southern boundary of the Canyon Crest footprint, they hit a wall. The Municipal Planning Commission requires a dedicated heavy-load fire access corridor, Ethan said evenly, and the environmental impact study mandates a high-capacity stormwater discharge basin. He paused. The only viable route for both runs directly through Silver Hollow's parcel. I said nothing. They don't just need a standard quitclaim, he continued. The lender requires a layered legal covenant, permanent emergency access rights, a perpetual maintenance agreement, and full indemnification for any future drainage liability. If Silver Hollow refused to sign that covenant, the bank would declare the site plan unviable. Funding would collapse. Canyon Crest would die on the drafting table. I turned from the window and began pacing slowly across the hardwood floor, each step deliberate, measured. Walk me through Langford's approach, I said. Ethan gave a quiet, humorless exhale. He called 20 minutes ago. He didn't sound like himself. The polished arrogance was gone, the aristocratic certainty. He was cautious, painfully polite, stressed that this should remain a strictly professional exchange, suggested we avoid introducing unnecessary family elements into what he described as a straightforward real estate matter. I almost laughed. And you? I asked. I gave him nothing, Ethan replied smoothly. Strict counsel-to-counsel protocol. I confirmed representation of Silver Hollow Capital and its parent entity. I informed him we do not negotiate verbally. Any proposal must be submitted in writing. Smart. Then he made a mistake, Ethan added. I could hear the shift in his tone. He began probing, asking indirect questions about capitalization, liquidity, operational reserves. He assumed I was still small, still scrambling. He thought you were a lucky property owner operating out of a truck, Ethan said. He was fishing for leverage, hoping to intimidate you with the threat of extended litigation and force a quick, discounted surrender. I stopped pacing. So I corrected him, Ethan continued, his voice lowered. I gave him a sanitized but accurate overview of our structure. I informed him that Titan Ridge Development and Silver Hollow Capital operate with multi-million-dollar liquidity and diversified commercial holdings. I made it clear we are not capital constrained. I told him we don't need their cash, and we don't fear their litigation budget. Silence hung between U.S. What did he say? I asked quietly. Nothing, Ethan replied. There was dead air for 15 seconds. I could picture it, Langford recalculating. When he spoke again, his voice was unsteady. That is when he begged for the 72-hour extension. He said his clients urgently needed 72 hours to review the transaction framework. Ethan continued. Then his voice hardened. But we both understand what that really means. He needs 72 hours to sit down with Andrew and Madeline and explain that the daughter they methodically erased is now holding the trigger to their entire generational legacy. The silence that followed felt dense. The low mechanical hum of the air conditioning filled the executive suite, loud in the stillness. 3 years ago, I had walked out of that frozen mahogany dining room with nothing but my dignity and a cheap plastic pen. Now the architects of my humiliation were sealed inside a structure they could not legally complete, and I possessed the only key. I didn't laugh. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't tremble with anger or revenge. What settled over me wasn't emotion. It was clarity. Cold, surgical, absolute. The board was finally arranged. I lowered my gaze to the architectural blueprints covering my desk. Precise lines, uncompromising boundaries, systems engineered to hold weight. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice stripped of all warmth, steady and hard as cured concrete. "From this moment forward, we do not answer a single direct call from anyone with my last name. No private meetings. No informal discussions. Every communication, every proposal, every word goes through legal counsel." I inhaled slowly, feeling the full weight of the power I had built over 3 relentless years. "From now on," I added, "everything goes through the attorneys, even the apologies." The 72-hour clock had officially begun. While Victor Langford scrambled to contain the damage, Ethan and Daniel moved with precision. They launched a targeted sweep through archived correspondence, external contacts, and old underwriting channels. Daniel quietly called in favors from industry relationships he'd cultivated for years. By Thursday morning, Ethan placed a thick stack of printed emails across my drafting table. 2 years' worth. Madeline's correspondence to regional brokers, secondary lenders, and even 2 of my former project managers. Reading through them felt like studying a textbook on psychological manipulation. She never made a single direct accusation. She didn't need to. Instead, she sculpted implication. Phrases like documented judgment concerns, unresolved internal governance risks, recommend heightened scrutiny. Each line was meticulously crafted. Corporate toxin designed to trigger fear in conservative underwriting departments without crossing into overt defamation. But arrogance had left a flaw. Ethan pointed to the timestamps. Her carefully worded warnings directly preceded the collapse of 3 specific bids tied to Titan Ridge Development and Silver Hollow Capital. The linkage was measurable, financially traceable, legally actionable. She had unintentionally provided the structural foundation for a tortious interference claim with calculable damages. We finally had proof. Not suspicion, not narrative, proof. Ethan didn't hesitate. Before noon, he drafted a ruthless, airtight legal warning. It wasn't an invitation to talk. It was a formal cease and desist order addressed directly to Madeline Ross, deliberately bypassing Andrew and Victor Langford. Attached was a detailed appendix listing exact dates, recipients, and quoted language from her communications. The order demanded immediate cessation of any reference to me, Titan Ridge Development, or Silver Hollow Capital in any defamatory or cautionary context. It was transmitted through certified courier and encrypted digital delivery to her law firm. The response from Scottsdale was immediate, predictable. Within 3 hours of confirmed receipt, Langford emailed Ethan in visible urgency. He urged us to pause escalation, requested suspension of formal adversarial positioning. The Ross family was officially proposing a private, closed-door family gathering to resolve the friction amicably. They wanted to sit around a table and hash it out without the suffocating presence of court reporters or official legal transcripts. I read forwarded request slowly, feeling a sheet of cold settle in my stomach. They still believed they could reach across the table and reposition me with the language of family. They still believed obligation would override strategy. I told Ethan to reject the proposal immediately. Not soften it, not reframe it, reject it. I dictated the response myself, pacing behind my desk as I spoke each word with deliberate clarity. My client does not maintain any familial relationship with the requesting parties. All future communication will remain fully documented and exclusively routed through respective legal counsel. No emotion, no acknowledgement of history, just structure. By Friday morning, desperation began to splinter their polished unity. A courier arrived carrying a thick cream envelope sealed in wax. Andrew Ross's familiar, sweeping cursive stretched across the front. I stared at his handwriting longer than I expected before breaking the seal. For the first time in my life, the patriarch was retreating. The letter was long, page after page of emotional framing. He claimed he had no idea the situation had escalated to such extremes. He insisted he never intended harm. He wrote about misunderstandings, miscommunications, unfortunate consequences. He asked me to pause hostilities, to meet privately, to speak as father and daughter before Canyon Crest collapsed under outside pressure. It was transparent. He wasn't invoking fatherhood because he regretted what he'd done. He was invoking it because his flagship development was hemorrhaging. If Canyon Crest had been secure, there would have been no letter. I fed every page into the heavy-duty shredder beside my desk. The machine reduced his apology to strips of paper and white dust. I did not respond. Less than 2 hours later, my private phone rang. I had forgotten to block my mother's number. She hadn't used it in 3 years. I answered, not out of hope, out of clinical curiosity. Helianthe Ross was unraveling. Her breathing was uneven, bordering on hyperventilation. She swung wildly between tears and fury, accusing me of intentionally humiliating the family in front of the entire southwestern development community. She shouted that my refusal to cooperate was turning them into a spectacle at their country club. I listened quietly. Even now, standing on the edge of catastrophic financial damage, her priority was not truth. It was image. She did not grieve the daughter she discarded. She feared the whispers. She feared the visible cracks forming in her porcelain world. When she finished, I ended the call without a word. Then I blocked the number permanently. Late Friday afternoon, the final mask fell. Madeline bypassed Victor Langford entirely and called Ethan's direct office line. Her voice carried the same aristocratic sharpness it always had, composed, condescending, certain. She demanded to know what I thought I could possibly accomplish with what she described as a performative cease and desist. She openly dared us to file suit. Ethan let her speak uninterrupted for nearly 2 full minutes. Then he responded with surgical calm. He explained that we were not merely preparing a civil, tortious interference claim. We were simultaneously preparing a formal submission to the State Bar's Ethics Committee. He outlined, in measured detail, how her documented email correspondence demonstrated deliberate misuse of her professional authority to execute targeted financial sabotage. The silence on the line was immediate, complete. The arrogance drained out of her voice. When she spoke again, it fractured. The golden child, the untouchable one, was suddenly terrified. She pleaded with Ethan not to pursue bar review, not to jeopardize her license, not to destroy her career. In that moment, loyalty to Canyon Crest evaporated. Self-preservation took control. Ethan recounted the exchange to me that evening. I didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in watching them panic. What I felt was mechanical, calculated. The trap had triggered. They were no longer a unified tribunal seated at a mahogany table. They were fractured individuals scrambling to survive the consequences of their own cruelty. I looked at Ethan. "It's time," I said. For the next 6 hours, we drafted terms, comprehensive, precise, unbreakable. This wasn't revenge. It was structure. We built a legal framework rooted in consequence, not emotion. A contract designed to force them to confront the truth they had spent 3 years trying to erase. And as the final draft rolled out of the printer, I made one deliberate decision. I withheld a single condition, a devastating clause. I saved it, carefully, intentionally, for the exact moment we would finally sit across the table from them. The negotiation took place Monday morning in the glass-walled conference room of Victor Langford's downtown Phoenix firm. The arrangement felt less like reconciliation and more like a hostile corporate takeover. Ethan and I sat on one side of the polished granite table. Across from us sat Andrew Ross, Helianthe Ross, Madeline Ross, and Langford. The air conditioning ran high, but the real chill radiated from the people. Langford attempted to seize control immediately. He opened a sleek leather binder and slid a single sheet across the table. A cash offer. He pushed the single sheet of paper back across the granite table with one deliberate movement of his index finger. Given the documented legal and operational risks my client has absorbed as a result of your client's actions, he said evenly, those risks are materially tied to the viability of this transaction. We are not separating anything. The air in the room tightened. Andrew Ross cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie as if that small motion could restore order. For the first time since walking into the building, I leaned forward and broke my silence. I looked directly at all four of them. My voice was steady. Ethan opened his briefcase and placed 4 identical bound packets on the table. Heavy, precise, final. I didn't wait for them to read. I dictated the terms. First, I began, Canyon Crest will pay the independently assessed valuation price for the utility and emergency access easement. In addition, a permanent, non-negotiable, long-term maintenance fee will be embedded into the project's operating budget. I let that settle. Second, Madeline Ross will draft and issue a legally binding letter of retraction to every broker, lender, and project manager who received her prior correspondence. The letter will explicitly state that her previous comments regarding my professional judgment and the risk profile of Titan Ridge development were unfounded and factually incorrect. I watched her jaw tighten. Third, the Ross family will execute a strict non-disparagement agreement, permanently prohibiting the dissemination of any false, misleading, or damaging information regarding me or any of my corporate entities. The room was silent. Fourth, the trust may not be used for public relations leverage. Her composure cracked. Finally, I continued, all future contact with me for the remainder of our lives will occur strictly through legal counsel unless I provide explicit written consent otherwise. The moment I finished outlining the retraction clause, Madeline slammed both palms onto the table. The sound echoed sharply against the glass walls. Her expression shattered. The pristine composure evaporated. She realized immediately what the retraction would mean. Not just financial damage. Reputational exposure! Her voice rose, frantic and furious. She invoked childhood memories, family loyalty, shared blood. She demanded to know how I could do this to my own family. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I turned slightly toward Ethan. Page 4, I said calmly. Andrew Ross looked down at the packet, his face drained of color. He seemed older in that moment, smaller. He reached across the table, his voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before. I was wrong, Caroline, he said quietly. I know I was wrong. But you don't have to go this far. I held his gaze. I'm not going far, I replied evenly. I'm simply hiring a lawyer the way you always taught everyone else to protect their assets. The sentence hung in the air like a blade. Then Ethan executed the final maneuver. He removed the compiled dossier from his briefcase. Madeline's emails, the documented financial losses, the drafted tortious interference framework. He dropped the stack squarely in the center of the granite table. The sound carried. Heavy. Decisive. Victor Langford stared at the pile. Slowly, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he turned to his clients. He advised them to sign. Losing hundreds of millions in primary funding would be catastrophic. Their egos were not worth that risk. The defeat was complete. Andrew Ross picked up his fountain pen first and signed. Helianthe followed, refusing to lift her eyes. Madeline was last. She held the pen above the dotted line for a long, trembling minute. Her hand shook, rage and humiliation colliding, but she had no leverage left. She signed. When the packet returned to my side of the table, I picked up my pen. I signed the final easement authorization. Not to earn my way back into their house, but to lock the board permanently under my rules. We stood. No one reached across the table. No one offered a handshake. Ethan and I walked out of the conference room without another word. The heavy glass doors closed behind us with a muted click. When I stepped through the lobby and out onto the sidewalk, the Phoenix sun hit me full in the face. Blinding, relentless. 3 years ago, that same heat had felt suffocating, like the desert itself was pressing down on my chest. This time, it felt different. It felt clean. The warmth wrapped around me, but it didn't smother. It felt like something washing over me, not erasing the past, but sealing it. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A secure message from Ethan. Attached was the fully executed agreement. Scanned, countersigned, timestamped. Every clause, every condition. Legally binding. Beneath the attachment, he had written one line. Deal closed on your terms. I stood there on the sidewalk for several seconds, the city noise moving around me, and closed my eyes. I exhaled slowly. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I didn't feel the need to look back at the building. What I felt was something far rarer. Peace. Not because they had finally admitted I mattered, not because they paid, not because they signed, but because from this exact moment forward, they no longer possessed the power to define me. The daughter they tried to erase had built her own foundation, and it did not rest on their approval. By Tuesday morning, the consequences were already unfolding. Madeline's retraction letters were sent exactly as drafted, certified, time-stamped, legally airtight. No emotion, no explanation. Just a formal correction issued to every lender, broker, and underwriting executive who had received her prior professional concerns. Within 48 hours, 3 regional banks that had quietly stalled Titan Ridge proposals over the past year reached out, requesting updated financial statements. One institutional lender who had previously categorized us as high scrutiny removed the internal risk flag from our profile entirely. No apologies, no dramatic reversals, just a measurable shift in institutional posture. In commercial development, reputation rarely explodes. It recalibrates. And the recalibration was immediate. By the end of the week, the $1 million apprenticeship trust was formally established under independent administration in Arizona. The funding cleared without ceremony. No press conferences, no charity galas, no Ross family branding attached to polished plaques. The foundation's public announcement was a single paragraph in a trade bulletin. A privately funded scholarship supporting young women entering commercial construction and site management across the Southwest. No last names, no legacy positioning, just access, just structure. Canyon Crest broke ground the following quarter. The cranes rose against the desert skyline. Concrete poured, steel lifted. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Andrew Ross no longer commanded investor panels with effortless dominance. There was a hesitation now, faint but present, in the way analysts asked questions. Victor Langford began appearing less frequently at compliance summits, and Madeline, once a confident fixture at underwriting conferences, reduced her public speaking calendar to carefully controlled engagements. No one openly confronted them. No one needed to. In an industry built almost entirely on perception, documented correction is louder than confrontation. Back in Denver, Titan Ridge development expanded without obstruction. 2 industrial acquisitions closed in the fourth quarter without unexplained underwriting delays. A municipal partnership that had stalled for 18 months cleared environmental review in record time. The invisible resistance that once followed my name had evaporated. Not replaced with admiration, replaced with neutrality. And neutrality, in business, is power. Silver Hollow Capital retained ownership of the remaining parcels surrounding Canyon Crest. The easement was permanent. The maintenance covenant was embedded. The indemnification clauses were ironclad. The bottleneck was no longer leverage. It was structure. I did not return to the Ross estate in Scottsdale. I did not request a meeting. I did not drive past the Canyon Crest site. There was nothing left to prove. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about insulation. Power, I learned, is rarely volume. It is documentation. It is timing. It is patience long enough to let someone else underestimate you. 3 years ago, they believed inheritance was money redistributed across a polished mahogany table. They were wrong. The real inheritance was skill, endurance, leverage, and the discipline to wait until the board arranges itself. When it finally did, I didn't flip the table. I adjusted one piece, and the entire structure realigned. By the time the dust settled, the Ross name still existed. Canyon Crest still stood. But the hierarchy had permanently shifted. They could no longer erase me, and I no longer needed them to acknowledge me. The desert sun felt different that year. Not suffocating, not oppressive, just warm, just light. And for the first time since I walked out of that dining room 3 years earlier, I understood something clearly. Walking away was never the loss. It was the first move. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Walking away does not mean losing. 3 years ago, I walked out of a room where my worth was reduced to a failed investment. I signed away money, status, and a last name that had defined my entire childhood. At the time, it felt like I had been erased. But I wasn't erased. I was being redirected. What my family never understood is that independence is not built in one dramatic moment. It's built in quiet mornings, in long nights, in contracts reviewed twice, in work done when no one is watching. It's built in discipline, in documentation, in refusing to let bitterness make your decisions for you. Revenge is loud. Real power is quiet. I didn't win because they apologized. I didn't win because they paid a price. I won because I stopped needing their approval to define my value. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the lesson that you can build something stronger than what tried to break you. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you were a liability, don't fight to prove them wrong. Build something so solid they can never erase you again. If this story spoke to you in any way, I'd truly love to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone in order to protect your own peace? Have you ever rebuilt your life from a place where others thought you would fail? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story resonated with you the most. I read your thoughts, and this community grows stronger because of your voices. If you believe in quiet strength, strategic resilience, and building your own foundation instead of begging for validation, Please take a moment to like this video. It helps the story reach others who may need to hear it right now. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future stories about boundaries, courage, and reclaiming your power. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder. Sometimes the strongest move is building your own board.